Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Geopolitics, Identity, and the Fight for Civil Rights. This is the third installment in our ongoing series, co-hosted by the Committee of 100, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and APA Justice. This series was born from a simple but urgent conviction that the challenges facing Asian Pacific Americans cannot be understood in isolation from the broader forces shaping our world. As US-China relations have grown more fraught, many Americans of Asian descent have found themselves navigating deeply personal questions about identity, belonging, loyalty, and the rights as members of this society. History is instructive here. Periods of geopolitical tension rarely stay confined to foreign policy. They ripple inward, shaping public perception, influencing government action, and touching the daily lives of communities far from the halls of power. Recognizing that dynamic is essential not only to defending our civil rights, but to fulfilling the promise that every American deserves to be treated with fairness and dignity. Today, we're fortunate to have distinguished voices to help us examine these questions with the seriousness they deserve. We're grateful to our speakers and to each of you for making time for this conversation. We thank the audience for questions submitted in advance of the webinar. Please submit additional questions in the Q&A box. We will address as many of the questions as possible during and at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is recorded and will be posted on the websites of the three host organizations and YouTube channels. A post-webinar survey will be conducted right after the session. We appreciate your completion to help guide our future webinars. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Joanna Yanqing Derman, Director of the Anti-Profiling, Civil Rights, and National Security Program at Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you again to the co-hosting organizations of this event, APA Justice, C100, and the U.S.-China Education Trust for the opportunity to moderate what promises to be a lively discussion. To that end, I am so delighted to be welcoming two distinguished experts to work through these questions on geopolitics, identity, and the fight for civil rights. I'll note they are both participating in their personal capacities. First, we have Edgar Chen, Special Advisor to the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, NAPABA. Edgar has over 2 decades of legal and advocacy experience across private practice, nonprofits, and 3 federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, Treasury, and Commerce. He holds degrees from Princeton and the University of Chicago Law School. And next, we have Frank Wu, President of Queens College, City University of New York. Frank previously served as Chancellor and Dean of the University of California Hastings College of the Law and spent a decade on the faculty at Howard University. He is a past chair and president of the Committee of 100 and author of the book Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. And without further ado, we will turn to the discussion at hand. So right off the bat, I want to pose a question to the both of you on something that I think many viewers in the audience have been tracking or may have seen on the news, especially if they work in the API policy space, which is that 2 Maryland state delegates recently drew sharp criticism after the release of a podcast in which they mocked fellow lawmaker Delegate Chow Wu, ridiculing his accent, and following a legislative disagreement, falsely suggesting that he was acting as a Chinese spy. These comments, of course, were swiftly condemned by the congressional leadership and API advocacy groups who called for an apology as well as stronger standards of conduct. My question or questions are, what does this incident reveal about where political criticism crosses into racialized suspicion and conspiracy framing, particularly for API elected officials? And moreover, what responsibilities do lawmakers and institutions bear in preventing this kind of rhetoric that reinforces just really harmful stereotypes, especially amidst the background of this heightened US-China geopolitical tension? And maybe we'll start off with you, Frank.
The pandemic is very relevant to this. We saw during that terrible time period, even though Asian Americans were overrepresented as doctors and nurses, exposing themselves to potentially fatal risk, that they were attacked, physically attacked, shoved to the ground, kicked in the head, spit on, even murdered. And it all starts with that sort of name calling, go back to where you came from, you made us sick, this is your fault. And it wasn't just people from Wuhan, China. It wasn't just people of Chinese descent. There were people who were Korean, Burmese. There were people who were Latina and looked Asian who were attacked. And many were US citizens, green card holders, third, fourth, fifth generation. It didn't matter. We saw this with the Vincent Chin case in the 1980s with the internment of Japanese Americans. Again and again and again, Asian Americans are thought of as the perpetual foreigner. Our heart belongs elsewhere. Doesn't matter if you have an American name that is what's on your birth certificate. Doesn't matter if you're Christian. It doesn't matter if you're assimilated. It's still, you're really one of them, not one of us. And all the tension between the US and China spills over. Let me just try to very briefly make 3 points. First, mocking people for their accents is just wrong. It's the sort of common cruelty of childhood bullying. I'll tell you, the saddest thing for me is my parents who were immigrants. I was born in the United States, but my parents actually, they didn't quite understand bias, racial discrimination. They didn't speak the language of civil rights because they literally spoke another language. What saddens me is sometimes they thought that it was their accents that was holding them back. They blamed themselves, not realizing, no, it's the bigotry of others, but it's not really about the accent. You know how I know? If you close your eyes and listen to me, I sound like a kid from Detroit, because that's where I'm from. But I've been told that my accent is holding me back, right? I've been told, oh, that accent of yours. Yeah, like the Midwestern accent that I have, and social scientists study this. It's a visual cue. You see my face versus if I'm on the telephone, you imagine an accent. Even if you think you're not racist, everyone does it. It's unconscious. All right, second point. We have a consensus. It's fragile. It's tested every day, but it's through the civil rights movement, the historic struggle for Black equality. What is the consensus? It's wrong to stereotype people. The consensus is, and it used to be 50 years ago, racism was in your face. It was blatant, unapologetic, but generally in polite society, we agree you shouldn't be doing this. Right? But third, what has happened now is some people say, well, we have one case of something that's happened, maybe two cases. And if one person who's Chinese American does something wrong, well, you're a suspect too. Except that violates the very principle of not stereotyping. What is a stereotype? It's when you take one case, maybe you take two cases, and you use a superficial characteristic, ethnic background, and sometimes you don't even match it up right? Wrong ethnicity, not really my people, right? But a stereotype is you then blame everyone who looks like that. Now, if you did this, if someone, and I want to make sure this comparison comes out right, I have fought for, worked with, and will continue to fight for and work with African Americans who still have to fight for equality. If someone who is Black commits a crime and the police said, oh, we got to round up all the Black people, we would all look at that and say, what? Are you out of your mind? That's not just wrong, that's ineffective. That's what stereotyping is. That's what's happening here. People look at maybe one case, and they say, there was a Chinese person there. You're of Chinese background, can't trust you. Last point I'll make is the reason I mentioned perpetual foreigner is for Asian Americans, part of the struggle is to explain this is a civil rights issue. It's the same thing as for other people of color, other minorities, because what gets invoked is national security and Asian Americans being neither black nor white, not looking to some like members of the society, members of the body politic. Even people who believe in civil rights sometimes are dismissive because these are Asians, they're foreigners, which is the stereotype at work. What we say about African Americans and others doesn't apply because now suddenly national security, these are outsiders, except that is the stereotype. We're not outsiders. And if elected officials can do this to someone else who's an office holder who was voted into office, think about the kid on the playground or any one of us walking down the street.
Yeah, I think that's so poignant, and especially what you were saying at the very beginning about the role that unconscious bias plays in this as well, and how that moves and shapes our actions is a really important piece. Edgar, I want to throw it to you as well in case you want to jump in and comment on what happened in Montgomery County.
Yeah, I think that first I agree with wholeheartedly with what Frank has to say on this and his observations. I think that if you are committed to sort of ideologically combating Chinese communism, the way to do that is to celebrate the American democratic process and that someone like Delegate Wu has come to the United States and done a distinctly American thing to do, which is run for local office and represent the people. And it's very democratic. We would like to say that's what distinguishes us from other types of institutions. But this, I think, is undemocratic and flies in the face of that. This is not the way to wage a Cold War in terms of ideas, right? Resorting to that. And I think if you look back at the history, during the Cold War, the Soviets had always said, well, we're going to, be on the higher moral ground here because of the racism and segregation in the United States, right? And similarly, the United States obviously held out that human rights abuses behind the Iron Curtain was reflective of how the communist system was inferior to a Western-style democracy. So we haven't seen much difference here.
Could not agree with you more. Thank you, Edgar. I want to move to talk about now a specific policy issue that has really taken over the API advocacy space in recent years, and that's alien land laws, which of course seek to prohibit certain foreign citizens from being able to purchase land in the United States. Just some quick math on this, some quick numbers. According to the Committee of 100, no less than 525 bills have been introduced since 2021, 63% of which restrict Chinese citizens from owning property, with 149 bills considered in 2023, 126 the next year in 2024, 133 in 2025, and 76 so far this year in 2026. As of May of this year, approximately 28 states have enacted such legislation, and yet Chinese affiliated entities account for just a paltry 0.03% of total U.S. farmland, compared to, say, Canada's 33% share of all foreign-owned agricultural land. Moreover, these laws send an unmistakable signal about who is welcome and who is not welcome in this country. And that kind of chilling effect has consequences. It ripples well beyond any kind of single transaction. And so given that we already have this federal entity, a federal body, it's called the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States, specifically designed to review foreign land purchases for national security threats, what does it tell us that there remains this fixation on passing new land law legislation? And I'm talking both at the state level and at the federal level. Is this a genuine national security justification? Is there a genuine national security justification here? Or is this a pretext for racial profiling?
It's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. You go back 1 century, and this was common. Back then, folks also, they don't want to own up to their bigotry. And back then, just as now, some people were clever. So you know what they did back then? They didn't say, in some states, they didn't say Chinese people, Japanese people. They used a phrase. You can look all this up. It's called aliens ineligible to citizenship. You think, oh, well, that's okay. It's just aliens who can't become citizens anyway. Well, we don't have as much of a problem with it. Except if you look further, the only category of aliens ineligible to citizenship were Asian people, due to the Chinese Exclusion Act expanded in 1917 to an Asiatic barred zone. And everything I say, I invite you to multitask and Google. You can look up. The Supreme Court decided a little more than a century ago 2 cases about first someone of Japanese descent who wanted to naturalize. So remember, these are people, they want to become Americans, right? And he explained he was Christian, spoke English, was assimilate. And then someone of South Asian descent who had actually served in the United States Army. Supreme Court said, no, you can't become a citizen. There's a color bar, there's a line, and you're not white, you're not Caucasian. All right. So that meant that if you use the phrase, it's really clever. I want to credit bigots for being clever. Aliens ineligible to citizenship, you don't actually have to openly say the ethnic group. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948 struck all this down in a case they decided called Oyama versus California. What's important to realize about all these is it wasn't just land. It wasn't just aliens. They denied fishing licenses during the internment. 2/3 of those affected were U.S. citizens. So it all looks like, oh, it's aliens. We don't really care as much. But note too, history tells us it starts with the group that's aliens and extends to their kids and grandkids. And these laws now, some people aren't that clever. They're not hiding anything. They just openly say it's a specific ethnic group, meaning it's not about foreigners. It's about people of a particular ethnic background. And ask yourself this. Anyone who's Asian American, I'll bet you Nickel has had this experience. I know I've had it. I'm a native-born U.S. citizen. I have my passport. I usually have it around me in my backpack. Why? Because people question me. What do you think a realtor is going to do if I show up, or my cousins who are all U.S. born, and we want to go to an open house and look at some stuff, right? They're not going to say, hey, could you show me your passport? And it'd be just as bad if they started to ask me to show my passport, right? They're just going to assume you look foreign, you talk funny, right? Because we've all had that experience. Last thing I'll say is, even if you don't care about civil rights, there's a whole argument here. They sometimes call it the business case for diversity. What do you think has revitalized places like Flushing, Queens, downtown Flushing, which 50 years ago was a dump? It was Asian immigrants. Flushing is amazing. Best Chinese food, best Asian food of most types you're going to find on all of New York City, because starting in the 70s, there was an influx. So even if you don't care about anyone's civil rights, every single study shows that when immigrants show up, the economy is lifted. So you don't have to be of any particular progressive bent. You can just look at this and say, does it make sense to stop people from investing in America? How does that help the economy?
Yeah, I want to echo something that Frank said here, that these laws were specifically targeted at Asian immigrants and Asian migrants, right? We had the 14th Amendment guaranteeing birthright citizenship in response to Dred Scott and the plight of newly freed, formerly enslaved persons, guaranteeing them citizenship. Obviously, the Wong Kim Ark case follows up on that to expand to all persons born here. I know we'll get to that later. Aliens ineligible to naturalize, that is exactly pinpointed at Asian migrants. And what we see in today's iterations of laws, they say it targets those who are domiciled in countries that are listed as foreign adversaries under, what is it, 15 CFR 7.4. Again, to Frank's point, you don't have to name the country. But I think that if you look at when these bills are introduced, you see the sponsors railing against one country and one country only, and they single out China, even though Russia and Iran are listed. North Korea is listed. Other foreign adversary countries, so-called adversary countries, are listed. But I have never heard a speech where someone says, this is the threat posed by Russian, let's say, oligarchical, kleptocratic funds. I've only heard, Chinese, sort of malign Chinese influence is what they're intending to stop. But on the face of the bill, it looks race neutral, right? And so your question, Joanna, about is this a pretext for racial profiling? I think the evidence is clear whom this is targeting.
And I think, Edgar, you've got some other examples of this slippery slope. That's
Yeah.
not some professor's hypothetical example. It's getting extended to other areas.
Yeah. And one thing I think what the conversation I'm guessing will go in this, Frank, you talked about you don't have to be progressive, you don't have to look at this through any political bent, but there is something that is interesting that has struck me, and Frank, you mentioned this about economic growth in Flushing. And that is to say that the way that advocates are fighting back against these bills is we're looking at this through, and you think these are civil rights progressive type of people, but looking at this through a free market lens, right? The market should decide. All of a sudden, who is protectionist and who is for the free market? It's been turned on its head because the best arguments I think here are that you want to improve the economy. You want to look at this not through an ideological lens, but through, Adam Smithian, if you will, economic lens. And again, the sort of tables have been turned really here. I just find that to be interesting.
I want to pick up on the best arguments thread because when I'm having conversations with people about land laws, if I'm in a meeting with a congressional staffer and maybe they don't know that much about this issue, they're new to the portfolio, or they're just wading into it. One of the pieces of pushback that I often encounter is, but shouldn't we be protecting our national security? Shouldn't we, like, isn't it true that the CCP, not China in general, but the CCP government is, trying to undermine US national security interests in certain domains? How do you push back against that argument in an effective way when it comes to land laws? Because we know, everyone here knows, that yes, they extend from the legacy of racial discrimination in terms of the original land laws that, Frank, you were talking about in the early 20th century.
Right. And, something that I try to do, and I want to be clear about this, I don't run around accusing people of bigotry. That's not effective. That just people get their backs up. Sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes you have to do it because it's so egregious, it's so out there. But I'd like to build bridges and show people how this is connected to other concerns, racial profiling of Black drivers. It's the same thing. If you look in Texas, there's a fellow named Stephen Pay. He's a real leader out there. He might be even part of this program. And I talked to him. I wrote a little piece for the Guardian newspaper, if you want to find it. And you know who he credits? Because in Texas, they have successfully, in some instances, fought this. He credits African American legislators because they reached out and they said, we know what this is. We've seen this. So you have to build bridges. This is not about Chinese, not about Chinese Americans, not about self-interest. This is about American principles. And what has made America great? What has made America great is welcoming people who saw opportunity. Somehow we've forgotten this ideal And driving people out is going to damage the economy. It's going to damage scientific research, and it's going to play into the hands of China. You know, suggesting that any of us with this particular color of skin, texture of hair, shape of eyes, or where our ancestors are from are somehow spies or secret agents. It's not just wrong, it's foolish, it's self destructive, and you're harming the very people who can help in the struggle. Let me be absolutely clear. Not only am I an American, not only am I a loyal American, I'll be honest. If the United States loses its status and China becomes the dominant superpower in 25 years, I'm going to be very sad. That would mean every choice my family has made for 3 generations turns out to be the wrong bet. Because sometimes people say to me, oh, China takes over, you're going to do great. Are you kidding me? You know, when I visit China, you know what people say? Oh, what a shame your Mandarin is so bad, right? um, I am sunk. So my self-interest is entirely invested in the United States. Now, let me say something that might be a little controversial because I want to be candid. There is something I worry about. Every now and then, and I can barely read 25 characters in Chinese, all right? I can write my name, I can write 1 through 10, that's about it. But I read and people help me and they translate things. And on WeChat and in social media, I'm just going to be honest. One of the things that some people, not all, not most, not even many, a few people do on social media, they do a couple things. One is they say, hey, other Americans better be nice to us because we really are going to take over the world. I think to myself, don't say that. You know, that's exactly the ineffective form of advocacy if you say the exact things that confirm the fears that people have. The other thing they say, and there are examples, I'm not going to name any names, but you can find this in the news. There's some people who are actually in public life. They might be running for office. They say one thing in English, and then on Chinese language social media, they say the opposite, and they get busted. They should get busted. You know, lots of people read Chinese, including people who aren't Chinese and who might not be supportive of the stuff you're saying. And so if publicly you're in favor of LGBT rights, but then on WeChat you write some stuff, you're going to get found out. So this is about American ideals, American self-interest, having Asian immigrant scientists. That's what makes our universities great.
Yeah, I want to add something to that. Uh, Again, we're living in the upside down right now. Louisiana has a bill on the books, S 395, which calls for the expropriation of land owned by Chinese citizens. They use the word expropriation. As I understand it, during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese communists had slogans that said expropriate lands from local tyrants and distribute their farmlands. This, like, and so the best, Joanna, you asked, like, what's the best talking point on this? And for me, the best talking point on this, besides we talked a little bit about the free market sort of arguments here, how it's bad for the economy, it's the economy stupid. But the best thing I've heard on this is uh, I thought it was the Chinese Communist Party that was in the business of taking land away from Chinese people.
Mm-hmm.
So the legislators behind these calls to expropriate land from people of Chinese origin or Chinese residents, etc. They're beating the Chinese Communist Party to the punch in terms of Fifth Amendment type of rights here.
That's true. That's a great point. Both Frank and Edgar. I want to pull on the thread of it's the economy, stupid, and take this just a little further because I think this type of economic targeting, specifically under national security frameworks, is evolving, and we see it spreading into new policy issue areas, different spaces, using different types of rhetoric. And I'll give you two examples that have been on my mind recently. Number one is that on the federal level, the Trump administration recently changed SBA-backed loan eligibility criteria, really just rendering small businesses that are even partially owned by non-citizens ineligible. And this, of course, cut off access to capital for immigrant entrepreneurs who have been working really hard to comply with immigration laws. That's one example at the federal level. At the state level, some of our viewers might have also seen that Iowa, we may have mentioned this, is considering a bill that would bar businesses and individuals from certain countries, including China, from obtaining licensure to establish or operate healthcare centers, which is just a truly mind-boggling and striking move given how vital immigrants are to our healthcare systems.
Yeah,
And
especially that, by the way, Joanna, that in Iowa, that's SF 572. It was signed by the governor. It is now law. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. It is about the economy, stupid. In rural states where healthcare is at a crisis point, and we need immigrants to be in the healthcare profession, not just doctors, let's say, but direct service professionals, people running nursing homes, nurse practitioners, nurses, aides, all of these jobs. I will also mention on the Iowa front, the sponsor there talked about this is to prevent Chinese entities from infiltrating our healthcare system. But the bill singles out Chinese citizens. So they've done what I consider a poor drafting exercise here. If the intent is to focus on malign Chinese foreign policy or malign influence, and the bill is entitled something like a bill to prevent foreign adversary entities from taking over healthcare. That's a policy debate, but without any evidence, it sweeps up individuals. It goes after individual citizens, right? So there's a bait and switch here. And again, it goes after, and I think what Frank said about the revitalization of Flushing, and we see that in other places. We see that in Lewiston, Maine, with the Somali immigrant community, despite all the current accusations about fraud, etc. Where immigrants go to economically depressed places, they typically turn it around. SBA loans, we don't know. I think, Joanna, we don't know what percentage of these loans might go to Asian American small business owners, but we do know that the message that is being sent is you don't get a piece of the American dream, and no matter how hard you want to work to improve this country. That's the message that's being sent.
right, even if you're only 1% owned
Yeah.
by a foreign individual or entity. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so interesting for me to hear you two talk about this and encounter the phrase foreign policy so much. From my perspective at an API organization working on domestic issues, it seems to me that so many of us are now being caught up in this tension between only working on, quote, domestic issues, and yet also being called upon to react and to analyze activities that more so occur in the traditional domain of foreign policy, right, slash national security. And, personally, I'm finding that while that model of bifurcating domestic and foreign policy may have worked in the past, in an increasingly globalized world, they are inextricably tied together, just really difficult to pull apart. It might be even impossible. So, how can the API community best prepare itself to work on these, quote, foreign policy issues? And maybe I'll throw it to you, Edgar, since I know that we've been talking about this.
Yeah, Frank mentioned Stephen Pei down in Texas, and here's the issue that I think front and center for U.S.-based civil rights advocates, right? If you go to bat for Asian American communities, The problem is that we get accused of shilling for Beijing, being a Beijing apologist. And Frank, I've never set foot in China. My parents are from Taiwan. I don't like it when the PRC flies missiles over, China to Taiwan over the strait every time, there's some election, going on that island. And but the idea that if I stand up for an impacted Asian American person here for their civil rights, that somehow this is at the behest of the CCP. This goes back to that first question involving the Maryland delegates, right? Right there. Um, that is really pernicious. But I will say that an understanding of what's going on foreign policy wise it's probably going to be necessary, Joanna, to just understand some of the rationales for these things like alien land laws. Well, I think it's probably because we see what is perceived as malign Chinese hegemonic activities in, let's say, the South China Sea, building of islands, and that looks like it's like a land grab. Well, will they do that in the United States? I think as civil rights advocates, we should understand maybe this is where some of the not irrational national security concerns or fears are coming from. And that way we will be better able with evidence to push back on what's real and what is perceived, right? But because there are some very legitimate national security concerns that are out there vis-a-vis China.
Frank, what are your thoughts on this, especially how what Edgar just said intersects with the concept of the perpetual foreigner that you were
Right. So,
talking about earlier?
something that I've realized, I can talk all I want about how I'm a kid from Detroit, Tigers fan. Don't tell anyone in New York City I'm a Tigers fan. It doesn't matter what I say because when I walk down the street, I still get the ching chong stuff or kids wanting to do karate moves, do you eat dogs, that kind of stuff. And in addition, I think we have to acknowledge something, which is some segments of China are promoting a sort of ethno-nationalist foreign policy. To Edgar's point, that means territorial claims. It means also trying in some way to, I don't think it works, but trying in some way to recruit spiritually, if not, in some more formal way, the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora. It's like, think about AI, right? I could say, not interested in AI, not going to be using it. It doesn't matter what I say. AI is here. Everyone else is using it. It's affecting my life, whether I know it or not. I had better pay attention, or social media or anything else. In this global world, you can't say, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what your politics are. You can't say, yeah, I'm just going to ignore the rest of the world. I'm just going to focus on the United States. I wouldn't mind if I could say that, but it's like saying I'm just going to ignore AI. I would regret that.
Yeah.
That said, for Asian Americans, there's also this issue where people assume if you've got cousins who you visit, if you go to Chinese school, and I'm a Chinese school dropout, if you like Chinese food, and who doesn't like Chinese food, right? That somehow you're a spy or foreign agent, right? As if it's criminal activity to visit your elderly relatives. For what other demographic group is that the standard? Stay away from your family, shun them, ostracize them, constantly disavow your heritage. So people tend to confuse language, culture, calligraphy, arts, just interest with must be a spy, right? Those are entirely different. The thing we have to be mindful of is there's change in the world, and that just makes people uncomfortable. The notion, yeah.
Frank, I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, if you look at the premise of today's webinar in this series on U.S.-China relations is the downstream effects, right? And one thing from the recent summit in Beijing was, I think President Xi asked about how can the two countries avoid the Thucydides trap. and this is, I think this is what you're talking about. This is from the stats from TAF. Among those who are concerned about Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, 85% of those polled cite national security concerns, job market, educational competition, culture, value, norms. We saw this after, the Beijing Olympics on fully on display. I think it scares folks that there's another power that can compete with the United States. I don't think that is an irrational fear. We've seen this through the prism of how some powers rise and some powers are in decline. I'm with you, Frank. I would like the age of American enlightenment, our values, which, I hold dear, to persist and still be dominant. But there is a reality in the world that we're not the only superpower.
Yeah, and it's which side are you on, right? There's change in the world and change in America, and those work together. The change in the world is, other than someone over the age of maybe 85, for the lifetimes of all of us in America, the US has been on the rise. The Berlin Wall fell in 89, the Soviet Union subsequently dissolved. So the US has occupied this incredible role in the world. And now there's a perception and a reality of China threatening that. So even if your parents or grandparents or great grandparents migrated here, or they came from Taiwan, but you look like maybe you're up to no good, we're associated with that whether we want to be or not. And the change that I celebrate in downtown Flushing, for some people, that's threatening. They look at that and they say, the Asians invaded, they took over, it's yellow, no one speaks English anymore. Not actually true. And the irony is, Asian American success is held against us. Edgar, the chart you showed, one of the things is fear. Asians have taken over the colleges, that we can't compete with the Asians in the job market. There was a historian, Ronald Takaki. He passed away some time ago, but he was the first historian to really talk about Asian Americans. He had this great quote. He said, if you look at the history of Asian Americans, they have been punished not for their vices, but for their virtues. That's the model minority myth. It's You work so hard, you're unfair competition. We can't keep up with you, whether it's building the Transcontinental Railroad or taking the SAT. Therefore, we got to keep you out because you're taking over. Look at the Ivy League. There aren't any real Americans anymore, right? That's the concern.
Yeah, and I think going to this question, Joanna, about where do we sit this cohort of Asian Americans, right? Are we Asians in America, or are we Americans of Asian heritage? That the word identity is in the title of today's webinar, right? And I think this is something that you and Frank have clearly described that is inextricable from this conversation. And going back to this question, is it about national security? Is it about foreign policy? Well, we also saw the president do an about face on Chinese student visas, welcoming up to 500,000, I think he said. And he also did an about face on purchasing of farmland in the United States as an investment, which, by the way, runs counter to his own USDA, National Farm Security action plan, right? So I think a really interesting question here is if the president sees and elevates the relationship with China, as equals and very transactional and on an economic level, do the national security concerns that have been touted over and over and over again, were they real to begin with? I think that was your question, Joanna, right, to start. Are these alien land laws pretextual, or are there legitimate national security concerns? I think about the heads of Intel, NVIDIA, and AMD, all Chinese Americans, two from Taiwan, one from Malaysia, or the head of TikTok, who was questioned on Congress, asked him, "Are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" And he said, "Dude, I'm from Singapore." Right? No, right? So even folks like that, captains of industry, there's still that fear. But I think, Frank, this you remember hearing this back in the 80s. It was often said the Chinese are successful everywhere except China, right? It was the diasporas, right? And now I think with China in ascendancy in such a short period of time, I think that is scary. But in a way, my friend Chris Kwok sent me an article that said this is very similar to how we perceive the threat from Japanese automakers, right? Obviously resulting in the murder of Vincent Chin. But this is cyclical, and it is about economic fears and, plight of working people, and whether or not like this economic competition is going to impact people on a daily basis.
And Asian immigrants are working people. Part of the model minority myth is, oh, you're all doing so well, you got no problems. Well, you look at Silicon Valley, you look at people who are actually enslaved, slave laborers. And if you look statistically, Asian immigration has a distinctive characteristic. The curve has two peaks. So on the one hand, you do have high net worth folks. On the other hand, you got the Uber drivers, people who are undocumented, people who are nail salon operators, restaurant owners, mom and pop businesses. It is not true that Haitian Americans are uniformly well to do, but that's part of the cause of the resentment. Here's the thing about politics, and we saw this during the pandemic. If you get everyone riled up and angry, it's those people. They're the ones who spread this disease. If you then say, no, it's okay, we exaggerated, it's too late because you've already gotten people all riled up and angry. So even if someone who holds high office does a 180 and says, yeah, never mind, I'm not blaming them anymore, well, the person who is angry is not going to say, oh, okay, well, nah, never mind, I'm now not going to beat you up, right? That's not the way these emotions work. Once you demonize people and you say, you know why you don't have a job? It's those little yellow people. That's what was said in Detroit in the 1980s, the little yellow people.
Yeah, and to that point also, I want to put in a plug for Frank, you and I are both attorneys, and one thing that and Joanna, you know this from advocacy over alien land laws, the federalism argument seems to be really the primary vehicle here because this is what happens. The foreign policy should be the exclusive realm of the federal government, but you've got a patchwork of different states enacting all of these different laws. We talked about Iowa, we talked about Florida. There's no cohesion here. This looks terrible and it's bad policy, but guess what? Where's the answer? The answer is in the damn Constitution of the United States that says, foreign policy, the right roles here.
Well, it seems to me that what we're kind of describing is that there exists this narrative, this rhetorical line that says, these two global superpowers, the United States and China, are going at it head to head, and if one rises, the other has to fall. And that's a very zero-sum way of thinking about it. Or that, if they both can't ascend at the same time, otherwise we're headed towards some sort of military conflict, right? Whereas it seems to me, and I would wonder, what your thoughts on this would be, that we, instead of kind of giving in to that kind of very bellicose rhetoric where you do get people amped up and amped up and amped up, you have to learn how to coexist, right? You have to acknowledge that, yes, you have certain geopolitical interests that one country is always going to have relative to other countries. Intellectual property theft, sure, that is a thing. However, for the most part, neither entity, neither global superpower is going away anytime soon. And so we should be thinking about how to coexist, how to collaborate, how to share resources, how to be diplomatic towards each other, rather than feeding into the impulse that, again, is very zero-sum, that we know as an API community can and will lead to increased racial animus, discrimination, and the like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah. Go ahead, Frank.
we get things backwards often. It isn't that Asian immigrants and Asian Americans are agents of foreign influence in the United States. It's actually potentially the other way around. That is, Asian Americans can positively influence China and the rest of Asia, and this has been true throughout history, so many reform movements, so many democratization campaigns have been conducted either by people who are expats in the US and went back, or who are deeply influenced by their cousins and by American examples. So the foreign influence isn't negative, it's positive, and it's going in the other direction than what people think is happening.
Yeah, I'll also put in a plug for C100's State of Chinese American Survey 2025. Americans favor cooperation with China, despite tough talk here. And Frank, you're absolutely right. I think this is, and this is why it's so great to have U.S. China Educational Trust on this, sponsoring here, because it's about people to people connection. We talked about Iowa, and who they love in Iowa? The President Xi Jinping. He's lionized in Iowa by farmers because they look at that relationship. I talked to someone today from Iowa, and she said, "Oh, yeah, we talk about like his visit still all the time, like
Soybeans.
soybeans." Correct. Iowa wants to feed the world. Right. And it's back to that thing. It's the economy. So it's not a red scale. It's not about red. It's about green. Right. In many ways. And I think if we look at that, which I think that's why I think the shift in rhetoric by the president also very interesting here. Is it a good thing? We tend to attribute a lot of the animus from the COVID times to the president's rhetoric, but on this, it's yet to be seen. Will it have influence down the line? Outside of Washington too.
Got it. And that's a great note to end on right here. For this discussion, at least, there are a few questions that we've received in the chat, and we also received a few questions from audience members before we started. I'm going to pull just a couple at random if we could keep our remarks to about the 2 to 3 minutes mark. I'm going to ask, let's start with you, Edgar. What can Asian Americans do to become more involved in the political process and build personal influence within their communities?
I would say, I'll keep it quick. Your first question was about Delegate Chow Wu, right? Get involved. It doesn't matter what party, run for office, talk to your neighbors, and that's as American as it gets.
That's great. Thank you. Frank, how should Asian Americans hold elected officials accountable when constitutional norms are being violated? And what is the toll of this political climate on community mental health in particular?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's difficult being Asian American because you're constantly scrutinized. And then if you say something, the response is, "Oh, what are you complaining about? You have it easy, and it's better for you here than in your homeland," as if this isn't our homeland, right? So it's really difficult to even talk about these issues. But the pandemic hate crimes made clear this is very real. Elderly people should not be shoved to the ground. They shouldn't be kicked in the head. Nobody should be shoved to the ground and kicked in the head. But the people who were targeted were of Asian descent because of this type of scapegoating. So there is so much that we can do by being involved, by showing up, by building bridges in coalitions with others who we can reach out to. And what can we do? You don't have to run for office, just vote. And I'm strictly nonpartisan, but I'm going to say the following, and I want everyone to think of their cousin. Everyone here has a cousin who voted in a way that makes you think, wow, you are going to regret that vote. And some of them have come around and at a holiday event said, yeah, that maybe wasn't so bright. But you've got another cousin who's going to vote that way in the next few weeks. So you know who you should talk to? Your cousin. Every one of us, can you all picture this cousin? Yeah. And you're related to him. You grew up under similar circumstances. Just talk to him and just ask. You don't even have to talk about idealism or anything. Just say, hey, you think it's going to work out for you if it goes that way? Just ask him that.
Exactly, exactly. I'm also seeing some questions in the chat about how to build those strong coalitions. And Frank, to your point, I think it starts with that initial conversation. Starts with your inner circle and working outwards from there. Like we were saying, this all comes down to the people to people diplomatic ties and relationships. I think that's a good place to end it there. I want to thank Edgar. I want to thank Frank for a very lively discussion. And I will hand it very briefly to Cindy Tsai, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of C100, for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Joanna, Edgar, and Frank, for this very lively question. And thank you for all of our participants who submitted questions and engaging with us. Just as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted on C100 APA Justice as well as USCET's website and YouTube channel. Please do take a moment to share it within your network. And then also, as Jeremy remarked earlier, we are continuing with this series. So please make sure that you are signed up on our organization's newsletters to stay up to date to future webinars on this series and other events. For those who are interested and able to, we have put into the chat box, as well as it looks like we're going to have a screen with QR codes. If you would like to support this program and other programs by our respective organizations, please feel free to do so there. And as a final reminder, once you leave this webinar, at the conclusion of this webinar, there will be a post-event survey. Please do take a moment to fill it out. We really, truly appreciate your feedback, and it does help us think about our programming in the future. And with that, I just want to wish you all a wonderful rest of the week, and thank you for joining today's webinar.